see you.
Perfect.
Okay, hi everyone, thanks for coming. So we're Platypus Affiliated Society. We're the Georgetown chapter. Platypus is an international organization with university-based chapters, and we host the discussion on the left. So some of the things we do are reading groups, teach-ins, and public fora. And we focus on specifically the problems and tasks inherited from the old left of the 20s and 30s, the new left of the 60s and 70s, and the post-political of the 80s and 90s, left to the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. Today we have Jack Wagner, who came from New York to give us a teach-in about the Second International Marxism in France. Yeah, we also have, if you're interested, we have like reading groups that meets on Thursdays at 6:30 in ICC 112, and we have a coffee break that meets in the ICC Galleria Tuesdays at 6 p.m.
Thanks, Emily. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Jack, and I'm a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Tonight, I'm going to give a teach-in on the Second International in France. I'm going to try and talk for about an hour. Hopefully, I don't go over much longer than that. But I want this to be kind of a discussion, so I guess feel free to interrupt me with clarifying questions. I want to have like an hour or so for discussion afterwards. But if they're really pressing, just raise your hand and I'll get to you. Just before I start, I wanted to express my gratitude to Platypus member Divya, without whose mentorship this teaching would never have happened. I was extremely lucky to have undertaken the course of study that I did under her wing. She taught me a great deal, and as I said, her help was integral to the production of the teaching. Here we go. Okay. The triumph of the Rassemblement National in the recent EU elections and Macron's subsequent calling of snap elections triggered the formation of a coalition of center-left and far-left parties that vowed to save French democracy from the imminent threat of fascism. This coalition, calling itself a Nouveau Front Populaire, or New Popular Front, has been characterized as a resounding success for the French left, both for its electoral performance, thanks to which it gained a plurality of seats in the National Assembly, and its regenerative function for the left in the wake of NUPES's crack-up in 2022. So NUPES was the predecessor of the New Popular Front, like a broad coalition of leftist parties in France. Yet the initial wave of triumphalism has already given way to outrage after Macron refused to appoint the NFP's preferred candidate, Lucie Castet, as prime minister, instead choosing Michel Barnier of the center-right party, Les Républicains, the Republicans. Ironically, Barnier's ability to govern now rests solely in the hands of the Rassemblement National, who have vowed to critically support his prime ministership so long as Barnier accedes to their policy demands. Predictably, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, leader of La France Insoumise, the main party in the coalition, responded by accusing Macron of, quote, stealing the election, while Socialist Party leader Olivier Faure chided Macron's appointment as a, quote, denial of democracy. Last Saturday, nationwide protests took place with thousands of French citizens hitting the streets in support of the New Popular Front. Rest assured, the NFP lives. The New Popular Front recalls, quite explicitly, the anti-fascist popular frontism of the 1930s. Its electoral success provoked leftists internationally to openly embrace the Popular Front as a model for emancipatory politics in the present. For example, in an article written in Jacobin shortly after the elections, contributing editor Chris Maisano praised the NFP's appropriation of the original Popular Front, arguing that the latter's legendary, quote, mythical allure is something that today's left should aspire to reincarnate. Maisano writes, quote, the NFP won because it successfully activated the mythic power of the original Popular Front's anti-fascist Republican legacy. For Maizano, then, the success of both the original Popular Front and the new Popular Front is indicated by their electoral victories and their ability to appeal to millions of French people. To be sure, there are those on the French left who are not so sanguine about the NFP or about its historical predecessor. Back in June, the Ligue Trotskiste de France, the French chapter of the Spartacist League, proposed a workers' united front between various Trotskyist groups in opposition to the NFP, thus dutifully rehearsing the old Popular Front versus United Front debate. Evidently, this pivotal moment in the ongoing crisis of neoliberalism is raising the historical legacy of the 1930s Old Left, specifically its Popular Front iteration. Present-day vicissitudes in capitalist politics have compelled the left to reconsider this history. Incidentally, I was at a Platypus panel on Tuesday in New York, and Grayson, a member of the ACP, quite explicitly said, yeah, what we need today is to reform the popular fronts of the 1930s. But interestingly, he thought the fascist threat was not the right, or what's considered the right in the United States, but the Democrats. He thought that was the fascist threat. Anyway, despite their, on many accounts, completely opposed readings of this history, and their consequently different preferences for particular moments of it, Trotskyists, Stalinists, and leftists generally nevertheless seem to agree that the 1930s Old Left offers something of an ideal that the left today ought to aspire to, or, if nothing else, from whose mistakes it might learn important lessons that can inform its political orientation in the present. Prompted initially by my fortuitous engagement with Georges Sorel's Reflections on Violence, over the last few months, I have studied a different moment in French leftist history, namely that corresponding to the development of the Second International. Although this period, which in France ranges roughly from 1880 to 1914, is less well known, and is certainly less talked about today than other moments in French leftist history. Throughout this process of familiarizing myself with it, I have been struck by how much the problems and questions the left faced in this period resonate with subsequent 20th century French history. I say it struck me because much of the left in the 20th century generally had an aversion to the Second International. They treated it, to borrow Marx's phrase, like a dead dog. This was the Marxism of the opportunists, the revisionists, the social chauvinists, etc. So the critique went. But of course, it was also the Marxism of the orthodox defenders of Marx and the great enemies of and polemicists against revisionism. Whatever was motivating the left's rejection of Second International Marxism, it certainly didn't mean that it was able to escape the latter's haunting shadow. What must be remembered today is that many of the same problems that appeared during the Popular Front period of the 30s, such as the meaning of the bourgeois republic, socialism's relation to the bourgeois revolution in 1789, its relation to the capitalist state and bourgeois parties, and the meaning of opportunism and revisionism, reared their head during the Second International's rise in France. These pressing questions were most sharply posed during Marxism's crisis in and through the Revisionist Dispute, which was kicked off in France by independent socialist Alexandre Millerand's joining a governing coalition with bourgeois parties against the rise of the right in 1898. Sound familiar? Okay. So in this teaching, I'll focus on the particular manifestation of the revisionist dispute in French socialism, an episode that has since been called the Millerand Affair or the Millerand Crisis. I'm going to begin by outlining the origins of the Second International in France and briefly sketch the diverse landscape of French socialism at the turn of the 20th century. I'm then going to situate the Millerand Affair as a particular manifestation of the Revisionist Dispute, which was a decisively international phenomenon of Marxism. I'll then move to outline the developments surrounding the Millerand crisis and how different parts of the French left responded to it. And in the fourth section, I'll consider the meat on the bones, how the Marxists of the Second International, focusing mostly on Karl Kautsky, theorized the Millerand crisis as a necessary consequence of the self-contradictory character of the international socialist workers' movement that provided actually an opportunity to deepen the latter's historical self-consciousness. And finally, I'm going to offer some concluding remarks. I'm going to stop after each section, so I guess if you have questions intermittently, we can go through them. All right, so the origins of the Second International in France. Although there were various followers of Marx and Engels in France throughout the second half of the 19th century, Marxism in France really has its origins in the aftermath of the 1871 Paris Commune, the emergence of the Third Republic, and the dissolution of the First International Working Men's Association, the First International. The defeat of the Commune and the Third Republic's stabilization severely weakened French socialism. Much of the pre-Commune leadership was either dead or in exile, and the Parisian working class was still recovering from the massacre committed against it by Adolphe Thiers and his Versaillais, the army that crushes the Commune in 71. After the Commune suppression, there followed a process of crippling ideological fracturing among French socialists. By the late 1870s, however, there were signs of a revival of both the trade union movements and the socialist movement. In 1879, the Marseille Labor Congress declared its intention to build a united French Workers' Party. The Congress was attended by many communards returning from exile after the adoption of the 1877 Communard Amnesty Law. One of these returning communards was Jules Gued, who, during his exile in Switzerland, found his way to the works of Karl Marx and became inspired by the impressive development of the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD. Gued returned to France, seeking to establish a mass socialist party with the German SPD as his model. One can date the official birth of Marxism in France to 1880, the year that Gued traveled to London to visit Marx and Engels, seeking their advice on drafting a program for a new French socialist party. The program of the Parti Ouvrier, adopted by the Parti Ouvrier, Workers' Party in English, in November 1880 was the happy product of this trip. It's upon speaking with Gued, who he finds rather obsequious, that Marx offers his famous remark that he's not a Marxist during that trip to London. Okay. Despite the obvious influence of the German SPD on the Parti Ouvrier, for example, the program of the Parti Ouvrier was primarily based on the SPD's founding document, the Gotha Program. France was certainly not Germany. The unification of German socialism, realized by the establishment of the SPD, and the subsequent leadership of the socialist movement by German Marxists, this is reflected in the 1891 Erfurt Program, which supersedes the Gotha Program and is a decisively Marxist program. These two things, unification and leadership by the Marxists, were not replicated in France. In France, the establishment of the Parti Ouvrier by no means unified French socialists. So the Parti Ouvrier almost immediately splits in 1882. We'll get into that. So a plethora of tendencies remained organizationally independent of each other until 1905. I'm not going to bore everyone by listing all these tendencies or getting into the weeds of their individual programs, but I think it's worthwhile to sketch the landscape briefly. Okay. This is, to start, I'm starting with the 1880s to 90s, where you have French anarchism, which has roots going back to the teachings of Proudhon, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Many anarchists are important leaders in the Paris Commune. By the end of the 19th century, anarchism's legacy was carried on primarily in the French trade union movement, where significant swaths of the leadership and the rank and file subscribed to one form or another of anarchism. It's also the 1880s and 90s is a high point for like anarchist terrorism, which is a thing in those days. Okay, that's one. Two, you have syndicalism, French syndicalism, which is overlapping with anarchism but not coextensive with it. I'm going to speak about this at length later, but for now, a few brief notes might be in order. So the word syndicalism derives from the French word syndicat, meaning union. While tendencies with very different perspectives, ranging from corporatist nationalists to cosmopolitan anarchists, could all fall under the category of syndicalism, what becomes the dominant form of syndicalism in France defended the independence of the syndicalist movement from the state and the political parties as necessary for the realization of socialism. Revolutionary syndicalists argued that the trade union movement was the revolutionary subject in industrial society. The rise of the organized militant French trade union movement, corresponding to the rise of French socialism at the end of the 19th century, was the socio-political foundation for the veritable influence among the working class that syndicalism attained. The historic achievement of the trade union movement was its national federated organization in the Confédération Générale du Travail, the CGT. And that's going to play an important role. Is it not on?
Oh, I'm just moving it.
Okay. As discussed, so that's two. Okay, three is Marxism, which we kind of discussed. People will call it Guettist because Guett is like so brilliantly embodying Marxism at this time in France. So in 1882, they split off from the Parti Ouvrier after a principal disagreement with the possibilists to form the Parti Ouvrier Française. So there's the Parti Ouvrier, and then they split, and then there's the creation of the Parti Ouvrier Française, which is a decisively Marxist party. And then the Marxists are later going to form the Parti Socialiste de France in 1902. Soon after, they will become one half of the United Section Française de l'Internationale Ouvrière, the SFIO, in English, the French section of the Workers' International. Bear with me. Okay, in 1882, constituting a majority in the party, the Possibilistes took over the Parti Ouvrier from the Marxists under the leadership of Paul Brousse. As their name suggests, the Possibilistes emphasized a gradualist, not a revolutionary path to socialism. Right? You're going to do what's possible, not the revolution, right? Which is down the line. Okay, they're an important strand of gradualism that aligned with the center-right wing of the left in 1902 to form the Parti Socialiste Française, which is not to be confused with the Parti Socialiste de France. I know, bear with me, right? Okay, possibilism is going to split. There's going to be a more radical current under Jean Aliment in 1890. They're going to be tired of Paul Brousse's possibilism, and then they're going to have their own split into a left and a right wing. The right wing is going to come here, and then the left wing is going to come to the syndicalist movement, which won't be aligned with any of the parties. Okay, that's three. Four is the Blanquists, led by Edouard Vaillant, who claimed the legacy of the great French revolutionary Auguste Blanqui. They initially rejected forming a mass socialist party, instead deciding to focus on building a small clique of revolutionaries who would provoke the masses into action during a crisis. However, as the success of the parties of the Second International become evident, most Blanquistes eventually advocated a mass socialist party in France, and many actually become Marxists and joined Gued's Parti Socialiste de France in 1902. Okay. Excuse me. Yeah.
I missed it. So who was the group that would provoke the people in the masses during time of crisis?
So it's originally the Blanquists,
Right.
who are like following Auguste Blanqui, who's like this master conspiratorial kind of revolutionary of the 19th century in France. But eventually they kind of reject that and see like the necessity for a mass socialist party, and most of them just end up becoming straight Marxists and come together in the Parti Socialiste de France in 1902.
Complete reaction.
Hmm?
Complete like instigator reaction.
Not a react. I mean, a lot of the Marxists think that they're in the line of Blanqui, but times have changed where the political tasks of the revolution require something other than a small clique of revolutionaries waiting for a crisis to happen.
So what do you mean when you said that Jules Gay, whatever, was like perfectly embodying Marxism at that time? 'Cause as I thought that like Marx basically thought he was a clown.
Right. I mean, so Marx thinks he's like kind of phrase mongering,
Yeah.
right? Right, and he's like too in love with Marx, and he's like, whoa, 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 I'm like not trying to be like a cult leader here. But I guess that speaks to what I was saying, that Get is like fervently a Marxist.
Okay.
He's just like the most prominent Marxist, is
Okay.
all I meant.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't quite catch it. Why did the Alemanists split from possibilists and Rousseau's?
So by 1890, the Alemanists are kind of over the, the localism and like the gradual reformism of the Rousseauists and the possibilistes. The thing about possibilism is it's coming right from the trade union movement. Unlike Ged, who was kind of like, a long-time political organizer and a kind of an intellectual. And so they have a certain perspective, which I think leads their left wing to kind of renounce all politics and go into the syndicalist movement. But we'll get there, yeah.
So when you say Blanc is like the instigator of like possible,
No. So sorry, these two are different things. These are different tendencies. Blanquism and
he
possibilities.
was before that.
Yeah, Blanqui is of the 1848 revolution, and 1871 he's imprisoned, but he's like the leading figure, even for prison.
You don't think possibles, right? We're kind of sick, or we're like, okay, maybe Blanc's way is not the way to go, maybe it's just gradual.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's a way in which all politics post-1848 is socialist, and you can have, like, vying tendencies putting forward different paths to socialism and all, plausibly claiming the legacy of socialism. And this is what I'm trying to get at. Is like, actually, Marxism is just like one tendency in France fighting for revolutionary leadership and the mantle of the French revolutionary tradition in a sea of other tendencies.
Just like most countries.
But not Germany, right? Where Germany, they're like leading the socialist
Or
movement.
Russia.
Even Russia, I mean, Germany is really like the flagship of the Second International. But I think that's part of the reason why, I think the French context poses different questions. But let's get there. Okay, so that was 5 of the 6. The last but not least is the independent socialists. They're mainly intellectuals who, in the mid-1880s, coalesce around Jean Malon's journal, Revue Socialiste, Socialist Review. Calling themselves the independent socialists, these intellectuals remained independent of the rivaling tendencies and sought to forge a path of socialist unity that didn't depend on accepting one brand of orthodoxy over another. By and large, the members of this loose clique sought entry into parliament without subjecting themselves to the discipline of any of the sects. Right? So they're like, we're going to do our own thing in parliament. I don't care what any of the parties say. So importantly, they're going to produce 2 of the most important French socialists of this era, Alexandre Millerand and Jean Jaurès. Okay. I have tried to underscore just how fractured the post-commune socialist movement that the Marxists vied for the leadership of was. Marxism was by no means the dominant tendency in French socialism throughout the last 2 decades of the 19th century, although it gets more and more popular and influential. While its growth throughout the 1890s was undeniable, Marxism in France was merely one modestly sized tendency among many others, all claiming the legacy of the French revolutionary tradition and all organizing to extend the latter into socialism. Okay, so from a bird's eye point of view, just to recap, we have more or less six substantial, clearly delineated tendencies. We have the anarchists, not organized in a single party, but pretty popular in the trade union movement. We have the syndicalists coming out of this burgeoning, organized, very militant trade union movement that advocate the independence of the unions from party politics. You have the Marxists who want a mass party, and they're going to end up forming the PSDF in 1902. And then they unify with the PSF in 1905. We have the Possibilis who split with the Marxists in the 1880s. They emphasize a parliamentary path to socialism. We have the Blanquists who eventually fused with the Marxists in the PSDF. And then finally the Independents, who are predominantly socialist intellectuals and parliamentarians hoping to unite the various tendencies. Yeah. All right, section 2. The Millerand crisis in context, the Dreyfus Affair, and the Revisionist Dispute. Okay. The Millerand crisis was a product of both the Dreyfus Affair and the Revisionist Dispute that beset all the major European socialist parties at the end of the 20th century. Sorry, the end of the 19th century. The Dreyfus Affair was the most important pre-World War I event in the Third Republic. The scandal rocked the Republic, and its impact was felt in all realms of French society, particularly its politics. In 1894, Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish artillery officer in the French army, was convicted of treason for passing state secrets to Germany and sentenced to a lifelong exile in French Guiana. In 1897, after it was discovered that leading officials in the French army had suppressed evidence proving that it was not, in fact, Dreyfus who passed on confidential information, but someone else, a popular campaign protesting Dreyfus's conviction emerged. France became practically split into two over whether Dreyfus's charge should be overturned or not. The Dreyfusards, those who supported overturning Dreyfus's conviction, made up of liberals, Republicans, socialists, prominent literary figures like Émile Zola, etc., perceived a conspicuous rise in anti-Semitism accompanying the anti-Dreyfusard movement, made up of anti-Semites, right-wing groups, the most notable being Action Française, much of the high-ranking clergy, and military leaders. And so you have the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. Moreover, many Dreyfusards accused the anti-Dreyfusards of posing an anti-democratic threat to the Third Republic. In 1898, a Dreyfusard coalition government came to power, promising to defend the Republic from the right-wing threat. In 1899, Dreyfus was retried, and although he was convicted again, his sentence was commuted and he was released. In 1906, Dreyfus was cleared of all charges. The 1898 government coalition, promising to save the Republic, was comprised of centrists, Republicans, liberals, radicals, and, controversially, a socialist. Agreeing to become the Minister of Commerce in Waldeck-Rousseau's government was Alexandre Millerand. Millerand, as we know, came out of the independent socialists and was one of the leaders of the caucus of socialists in parliament. Millerand was increasingly considered an essential figure in the ever more confident and increasingly unified French socialist movement. So for instance, in the 1898 elections, the socialists won 800,000 votes, which is a significant increase from the election prior. 2 years prior to 1896, he had given a rousing address to leading French socialists, preaching the necessity of socialist unity, which had been well received by all in attendance. When offered the ministry by Waldeck Rousseau, who was the leader of this coalition government, Millerand didn't hesitate to consult with the parliamentary socialists before accepting, presumably because he expected little backlash. When that backlash did come, Millerand, perhaps plausibly, defended his decision on socialist grounds. The ensuing storm was quite bewildering for Millerand. Socialists are Republicans, aren't they? They support democracy against the forces of right-wing reaction, don't they? So what was all the hoopla for? This is kind of the same experience that Bernstein has, right? He's like, what do you mean? I'm still a Marxist. I'm just like revising it, right? Why is everyone pissy at me? Okay, Millerand's fateful decision to enter into a government led by bourgeois parties threw both the French socialist movement and international Marxism into crisis. The Millerand Affair, as it was called, triggered Marxism's great identity crisis. The Revisionist Dispute, as it came to be known, manifested simultaneously in Marxist parties internationally, most famously in the SPD around the 1899 publication of Edward Bernstein's Evolutionary Socialism. The Millerand Affair, although less well known than the Revisionist Dispute in Germany, nevertheless raised seminal theoretical and practical questions for Second International Marxism. What was seemingly a mere dispute over tactics instantaneously became the opening salvo in the civil war between revisionism and orthodoxy. Rosa Luxemburg perceptively characterized the existential threat to the international socialist movement posed by the revisionist dispute as such, quote, "In the controversy with Bernstein and his followers, everybody in the party ought to understand clearly it is not a question of this or that method of struggle or the use of this or that set of tactics, but of the very existence of the social democratic movement. The meaning of Marxism's growth throughout capitalist Europe at the end of the 19th century, that is, its very success and its future viability, were now thrown into deep crisis." I want to stop here and pause for a second to emphasize this latter point, that the revisionist dispute was a function of Marxism's success, its existence as a significant social and political force in late 19th century Europe. I think this gets at an essential aspect of the revisionist dispute, namely its dialectical character, where the specter of Marxism's regression into opportunism was conditioned by the former's progress, and, even more importantly for the orthodox camp, how the specter of regression pointed beyond itself to the possibility and necessity of a more mature, because self-critical, revolutionary politics. Okay. For the orthodox faction in the Second International, the revisionist dispute was never merely about defeating revisionism or the opportunists. Rather, the very existence of a tendency within the socialist workers' movement like Bernstein's, which declared the goal of socialism to be nothing and the movement to be everything, provided an opportunity to deepen the socialist movement's historical self-consciousness. The emergence of opportunism demanded not mere condemnation, but, more importantly, a critical self-appraisal of the development of the Marxist parties and the specific problems and tasks produced by that development. Thus, the question that the orthodox Marxists posed was not what was wrong with revisionism, but, quite to the contrary, what truths about the workers' struggle for socialism were being expressed by revisionism's emergence within Marxism. If the dispute were framed in this way, the socialist movement might deepen its self-consciousness about how its struggle to overcome capitalism was producing within itself tendencies like Bernstein's that threatened to liquidate the goal of socialism in favor of pursuing reformist politics that merely reconstituted capital. Only once this level of self-clarification and self-analysis was reached could the problem of revisionism be transcended. The potential to deepen the movement's theoretical understanding of both itself and its object, capitalism/socialism, is precisely the source of the rather bizarre optimism expressed in the orthodox Marxists' polemics against revisionists. At the very moment when Marxism appears on the verge of self-destruction, these wacky Hegelian Marxists are cheering on this very development as the precondition for the further advance of the movement. Okay, I'm now going to read two quotes that I think perfectly illustrate how the orthodox Marxists tried to grasp revisionism as pointing beyond itself. Right? Not just a regression, but a regression out of which there might be a possibility. The first is from Rosa Luxemburg, and the second is from Lenin. There are a lot that I came across that are actually great, but time only allows me to do two. Okay, so here's Rosa Luxemburg, and this is a letter to the Parti Socialiste de France, the Geddes. Okay, quote, "But what about the internal crisis that we are going through, more or less everywhere? What about the doubts, the skepticism, the deviations in our ranks? Well, these too are nothing but a symptom of our growth. In the last 10 years, on the heels of the definitive collapse of bourgeois democracy, new layers of society have little by little passed over to us in their entirety, mainly among the petty bourgeoisie and its ideologues, the intellectuals. But these elements, which were pushed to us by the social, political, and intellectual poverty of current conditions, bring with them a way of thinking that is totally foreign to us, a different conception of the goal and the method of struggle of socialism. In the first place, they must be raised up by education to the class point of view of the proletariat. They must be subordinated, assimilated to proletarian socialism. In truth, this won't happen without serious friction, without the loss of forces, without violent crises. But these crises are only the false costs of the development of our strength. These are accessory phenomena of our growth, inevitable from the point of view of our historical evolution." Okay, and then this is Lenin. Everyone likes this one. It's his footnote in What is to be Done. The first footnote, chapter 1. Okay, incidentally, quote, this is Lenin. Incidentally, in the history of modern socialism, this is a phenomenon perhaps unique and in its very way consoling, namely that the strife of the various trends within the socialist movement has from national become international. Formerly, the disputes between Lassallians and Eisenachers, between Geddes and Possibilis, between Fabians and Social Democrats, remain confined within purely national frameworks, reflecting purely national features, and proceeding, as it were, on different planes. At the present time, the English Fabians, the French ministerialists, the German Bernsteinians, and the Russian critics all belong to the same family, all extol each other, learn from each other, and take up arms against dogmatic Marxism. In this first really international battle with socialist opportunism, international revolutionary social democracy will perhaps become sufficiently strengthened to put an end to the political reaction that has long reigned in Europe. So Lenin sees the international growth of opportunism, and he's saying, actually, this is quite consoling to me, right? Okay. To merely denounce revisionists as traitors to the movement or whatever would miss the point. Politics and capitalism expressed in alienated ways the crisis of bourgeois society under conditions of industrial capital. In its attempts to overcome capital, the working class, as the producers and reproducers of this society in crisis, necessarily produced forms of politics that expressed bourgeois society's crisis, but always in contradictory and never fully self-conscious ways. Thus, the proletariat's politics had hitherto been inadequate to the task of overcoming the self-contradiction of bourgeois society in capitalism. For Marx and Engels, the workers' demand for socialism in the 19th century was a high symptom of bourgeois society's crisis, not its antithesis. In attempting to overcome its exploitation and alienation, the proletariat conjured up utopias, thinkers, organizations, and slogans that merely reified aspects of capitalism, and this threatened only to obscure further and deepen capital's rule. For example, the workers' participation in movements for democracy, like the Chartists in England, while seeking to compensate for the social disenfranchisement of the proletariat by demanding political enfranchisement, gave rise to state forms, for example, the Democratic Republic, which actually end up perfecting and not abolishing the rule of capital. Thus, Marx and Engels set themselves the task of clarifying to the workers' movement how its very anti-capitalist social organization and activity was constantly throwing up new obstacles, how the project for socialism was self-contradictory. While for Marx and Engels, a rather disparate, loosely organized socialist movement was taken up as the object of dialectical critique, by the end of the 19th century, it was Marxism per se that had become dialectical and was thus in need of its own critique. The Revisionist Dispute in Germany took place between Bernstein, the executor of Marx's literary estate, who never actually conceded to renouncing Marxism throughout the entire dispute, right? So he's called a revisionist and opportunist, but he's like, no, I'm a Marxist. And the orthodox Marxists in the SPD. It was a dispute firmly within Marxism. In France, as Kautsky pointed out, I'll get to this quote, although Millerand and Jaurès, although Millerand and Jaurès were not self-avowed Marxists, they were certainly influenced by Marx and Marxism and never hesitated to invoke the latter in their speeches. Like in Jaurès's history of the French Revolution, like it's very clear, one of the three thinkers he's influenced by, I think it's like Plutarch and someone else, is Marx, right? So he's not like a Marxist, but he's like claiming the legacy of Marx. The orthodox Marxists attempted to grasp how Marxism itself had become a potential obstacle to socialism. The self-contradiction of the workers' movement was now being expressed precisely in the tendency of the workers' movement that claimed to be the most self-conscious of the self-contradiction. Thus, the self-contradiction was now being raised to the highest level, and if it could be theoretically grasped as such, it pointed to the potential for a great advance in the consciousness of the socialist movement. Importantly, Marxism's crisis was being expressed internationally in various forms, as what Lenin was pointing out. Although both cases certainly involved questions of theory and practice, and while I don't mean to make a vulgar separation between the two, it's also true that the immediate questions Bernstein's book posed to the SPD were theoretical ones, that is, ones about goals, methods, dialectics, while those posed by the Millerand Affair were ones having more to do with the practice of socialist parties, right? Tactics, coalitions, political judgment, leadership. Are we entering a bourgeois cabinet? Are we not? What is the way to get to socialism? Lenin, for example, observed how Millerand demonstrated practically what Bernstein had presented theoretically. Thus, Marxism's identity crisis was being experienced as a crisis of both means and ends, theory and practice, which allowed for a clarification of both and a clarification of their relation to one another. Through party literature, debates, congresses, local meetings, etc., the orthodox wing of the Second International attempted to grasp the different manifestations of the crisis as a unity, objectify it, and then work through it. Right? That's how we're going to deal with revisionism. All right, so that's revision. That's like the Millerand Affair in context. Now I'm going to actually get to it. Okay. Any questions?
Yeah, so about that Luxembourg quote, you mentioned that, if I understand correctly, it was essentially saying that, the influx of revisionists is, a necessary step in the growth of the movement for socialism. They just need to be expelled, essentially, or, subordinated to, the proletarian movement. Out of curiosity, do you think that says anything about the party form in general, because the parties have pretty consistently failed to do the expelling them part. Like even the SPD, which you mentioned, was like the shining star of Marxism within the socialist movement. Kind of inexorably marched from a workers' party to a quote unquote people's party, as they called it.
Right.
Specifically trying to incorporate the middle class. So I guess what I'm saying is do you think that, how does that quote age, I guess, in practice?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I guess the age is not great, but I think Luxembourg and Lenin actually called for the expelling of the revisionists. I think so.
Yeah.
And Kautsky kind of wavered and kind of kept them in the party. But I think what was important, whether Bernstein stays in the party or not, is not really what was really important for the orthodoxy. What was important was to grasp Bernstein as a necessary misrepresentation of the workers' movement. How is Bernstein possible? Right, is the question they want to pose themselves. But this is a great what happens with the revisionist dispute is something let's get to.
I'll save my longer question for that, but can you possibly put the quote of Lenin on the chat?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so section 3 now, right? All right, the debate within French socialism. Jaurès, Sorel, and Kautsky. Okay, now I'm going to move in this section to the actual events of the Millerand Affair, bearing in mind, right, how we, speaking with the orthodoxy, have contextualized the Millerand Affair as a phenomenon of the international crisis of Marxism. Okay, so the hopes expressed in Millerand's speech to leading socialists in 1896 that French socialism was moving towards unification were crushed by the divisions that followed Millerand's acceptance of the cabinet position. It was in response to Millerand's action that the socialist movement splits into the PSF and the PSDF, right here, in 1901-2. The PSF, the Jaurecistes, after Jaurès, as they were known, the Jaracis support Millerand's actions, right? The PSF supports Millerand actions. The PSDF are like, hell no, you guys are collaborating with the bourgeoisie. That was a terrible mistake for Millerand, right? Let's censor him. Okay, so the affair leads to a new division, as if there weren't enough, right, between the political socialists, right, the parties. Yet, it also re-aggravated the division between the parties and the trade union movement. For the revolutionary syndicalists, the whole affair confirmed their suspicions of parliamentary politics and parties. After 1899, they were never so sure of their commitment to maintaining the complete independence of the CGT from the politicians and their parties. The wounds were not immediately, if they ever were, easily healed. It took up until 1905 for the socialists to unite in the SFIO. Still incensed by the considerable support Millerand received from within the socialist camp, and buoyed by the considerable growth of the syndicalist movement, the CGT reaffirmed its independence from the SFIO in the 1906 Amiens Resolution. Right? So this unification of French socialism finally happens, and the CGT, right, are like, well, what are we going to do about this? Are we going to subordinate ourselves to the parties that are now unified? They're like, no, right? We remember what happened during the Millerand Affair. We know what that's going to mean for the working class.
Are the CGT the guests?
Sorry, the CGT is the National Federation of Trade Unions in France. Okay, I'm going to return to this history later, but I'm now going to outline the theoretical and historical assumptions underpinning the orientation of the three main tendencies. So the Jaracis, the revisionists, opportunists, more or less, the Marxists, and the revolutionary syndicalists, right? There are three orientations toward the Millerand Affair. Okay. So Millerand's entrance into a cabinet position in a bourgeois republic necessarily raised the problem of how the socialist movement ought to relate to the bourgeois revolution. Consequently, both the socialists who defended Millerand's decision and those who opposed it needed to clarify how the history of the bourgeois revolution came to bear on the pressing political question of whether socialists should enter bourgeois governments and coalitions with bourgeois parties. The Millerand Affair necessarily recalled 1789, 1848, and 1871, corresponding to the French Revolution, the 1848 Revolution, and Louis Bonaparte's election, and the Paris Commune. Right? Those are the three dates. All right. 1789, the French Revolution. The perceived threat to the Third Republic posed by the anti-Dreyfusard camp, particularly by the aristocratic military leadership, recalled the trauma of the First Republic's descent into Napoleon's imperial dictatorship. Accordingly, during the years of the controversy, socialists began writing histories of the First French Revolution. Between 1901 and 1904, Jean Jaurès published his mammoth 4-volume Histoire socialiste de la Révolution française, Socialist History of the French Revolution. In response, Karl Kautsky spent the next few years writing numerous articles in the SPD party journal Die Neue Zeit about French revolutionary history before republishing in 1908 his 1889 essay called, it's not really translated in English, but this is my rough translation, Class Conflicts in the Era of the French Revolution. Okay, so there's like 1789 flashes up, and we're all starting to write histories about, the French Revolution, whatever. Okay, alongside the various reappraisals of the French Revolution, many defenders of Millerand began calling themselves Republican or Jacobin socialists, further illustrating the degree to which the memory of the French Revolution mediated the dispute. Okay, 1848. The right-wing military threat to the Republic also conjured up the memory of 1848, when the Second Republic met a remarkably, in Marx's words farcically, similar fate to the first, resulting in the imperial dictatorship of Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew. However, Millerand's entrance into the government also meant that it was the first time a socialist had entered a government cabinet since Louis Blanc in 1848. Hadn't the socialist movement learned its lessons since 1848 in the bloody days of the June uprising not to join bourgeois governments? What did it mean that this history was being repeated, but this time in the context of a significantly larger, more class-conscious, and better organized international workers' movement? Okay. 3 is 1871, the Paris Commune. Great. So finally, the legacy of the Paris Commune was necessarily raised. For one, the Third Republic was quite literally erected upon the ruins of the dead communards. In this respect, the building of the Sacré-Cœur on the top of Montmartre, right, it's this big, great patriotic Catholic church on the top of the big hill in Paris, where Parisians refused to give back artillery guns to the National Guard, an act that birthed the Commune, was by no means coincidental. And so they built this church pretty deliberately. The first president of the Third Republic was Adolphe Thiers, the leader of the Versaillais that crushed the Commune. Yet even more odious was that Millerand was now a colleague of former general, come Minister of War, the Marquis de Gallifet, who had played an instrumental role in suppressing the Paris Commune less than 30 years prior. Thus, the charge of class collaborationism hurled at Millerand was hardly an exaggeration. The collaboration between a leading socialist and a Versailles general in the governing coalition laid bare the class struggle that lay at the very foundations of the Third Republic, and the inability of the socialists thus far to prosecute that struggle effectively. Right? Okay, so those were the 3 historical moments. They flash up, and they're in need of clarification at the time of the Millerand Affair. Okay, so this is how the orthodox Marxists are going to understand this history, and they're going to, I'm using Kautsky here as my interlocutor, and Kautsky is going to understand this history by giving a dialectical critique of both Jaurès and the syndicalists, right? Jaurès and Sorel are my other 2 interlocutors. Okay, Jaurès contra Sorel. Jaurès initially supported Millerand's entrance into the government as an evil, but one which his particular brand of socialism necessitated he critically support. Jaurès's socialist history of the French Revolution, written during the height of the intra-socialist dispute, presented a particular understanding of the relationship between socialism and the French Republican tradition that underpinned his critical support for Millerand's decision. Right? His writing this history has a purpose. Right? He's not just like an antiquarian historian. Jaurès was adamant that the modern socialist movement was the legitimate inheritor of the Jacobin Republican tradition. In his introduction to the socialist history, Jaurès stated that the French Revolution, quote, inadvertently prepared the advent of the proletariat. It raised the 2 essential conditions for socialism, democracy and capitalism, unquote. Under the leadership of the Jacobins, the First Republic established mass democracy in France, an accomplishment which, for Jaurès, socialism would realize more thoroughly and would thereby negate that other legacy of the French Revolution, capitalism. Thus, to uphold the legacy of the revolutionary bourgeois republican tradition in the present meant defending the democracy of the Third Republic from succumbing to the fate of the First and Second Republics. This support for Millerand's actions expressed by Jaurès, the independents, the possibilis, and other parts of the socialist movement on the grounds of needing to defend and extend the gains of the bourgeois revolution, was met with fierce opposition from the syndicalists. The Millerand Affair started right at the beginning of the period known as the heroic age of French syndicalism, spanning the first decade of the 20th century. Okay, as we noted above, right, so France's trade union movement, right, it's radical, it's heavily organized, it's organized in the CGT, right? So despite various attempts by the Marxists in France to align the CGT with their party, similar to how the German trade unions were subordinated to the SPD, the French trade union movement had consistently upheld its political independence. It was feared that aligning the CGT with either of the various socialist tendencies would ideologically divide the working class and hinder its ability to carry out unified economic and political strikes against the capitalist class. The general strike, during which a decisive majority of the working class would walk off the job, bringing the country to a standstill before coming to power, was French syndicalism's revolutionary strategy, in part because it didn't require a high degree of ideology or propaganda. You know, the workers, they know how to strike at the shop and floor, independent of any ideological commitments, and the general strike speaks to this, you know, second nature, as it were, in a way that parliamentary or party politics just can't, right? So they're like, we don't want to subordinate the unions to the parties. That's going to divide the working class. Our tactic to get to socialism instead is this general strike. Okay. Despite the increasing importance of Marxism in France, the Millerand Affair destroyed whatever hopes there were that the trade unions could be brought under a political banner. It said that. The anger that gripped the trade union movement in the wake of what they considered a betrayal by Millerand, Jaurès, and their acolytes emboldened the anti-parliamentary and anti-party sentiment in French syndicalism. Sorel's brilliant critique of the parliamentary socialists in his Reflections on Violence is perhaps the highest theoretical expression of revolutionary syndicalism during this period. For Sorel, the socialists, specifically Jaurès's affinity for Jacobinism, had become an obstacle to the proletariat's ability to conduct militant class struggle. Jaurès's praise for the emergency actions taken by Robespierre and the Committee for Public Safety reflected a pernicious statist tendency that was becoming common among French socialists and which threatened to relinquish the working class's achievement of social and political independence through its syndicalist organization. In the era of Third Republic Bonapartism, when the state increasingly took on the role of mediator between the classes, this is shown by like the government, right? In the Third Republic, they're like attempting to domesticate the labor movement, right? They're trying to regulate the frequency and the types of strikes that the unions are trying to do. They're trying to they build like a ministry of labor, right? So in the midst of all this, Sorel thinks Jaurès's appropriation of the Jacobins was the preservation of what he called, quote, the old cult of the state. He prophesied that upon taking power, these Jacobin socialists like Jaurès would be, quote, prepared to commit all the misdeeds of the old regime and of the old revolution, quote. So the Millerand Affair causes Sorel to essentially reject the bourgeois revolution as an ideological obstacle to the socialist revolution, and perhaps even a flawed project from the start, right? It's maybe not just only on tactical grounds that he's rejecting the bourgeois revolution. According to Sorel and syndicalists generally, it was not only the Jaurèsian revisionist tendency that had been inducted into the old cult of the state, it was also the Guettist Marxist wing, right? The latter, due to their participation in parliamentary elections and their commitment to organizing the proletariat into a mass party were included under Sorel's pejorative parliamentary socialist label. They were likewise accused of trying to liquidate the self-organization of the working class and stifle its revolutionary aspirations. This, he insisted, was what the socialists really meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat. The complete autonomy of the syndicalist movement from capitalist political institutions, parliament, and mass parties, and the doctrine of the general strike were the only effective antidotes to the statism and paralysis of socialism that had been evinced in the Millerand Affair. Okay, so Sorel on the one side is like rejecting republicanism for the socialist movement. Jaurès is like, yes, we're like inheriting that legacy, right? And Sorel is like, it's not only the Jaurezists who have this problem with the state, it's also the Marxists, right? The Marxists are down for like, a dictatorship over the proletariat, not the dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay. This is how Marxism is going to think of the two, right? I'm using Kautsky here. Okay, here's Kautsky writing in 1905, right before the unification of the SFIO. Okay, quote, "Just like in 1848, today we are dealing with not two, but three tendencies in the French socialist movement which exhibit some affinity to those of Blanqui, Louis Blanc, and Proudhon. Yet they are no longer as divided as those tendencies were, and have more in common. The spokesmen of all three parties invoke Marx." Okay, so he's thinking Blanqui is, like, the Marxists are inheriting Blanqui, right? This is Kautsky's idea. Jaurès is inheriting Louis Blanc, and Sorel is inheriting Proudhon. In the interests of French socialism, it is urgently necessary to abolish the one-sidedness of both of these tendencies, Sorel and Jaurès. This can only occur on the basis of Marxism. So this dispute within Marxism, socialism, is going to be adjudicated on what? On the basis of Marxism. Okay. How are we doing for time?
It's 8 o'clock.
Okay. All right. I'll try and move. Okay. In his series of articles in Die Neue Zeit, Kautsky tried to grasp the antinomy between Jaurès and Sorel, which he characterizes the antinomy between opportunism and anarchism as a political symptom conditioned by historical conditions, namely the development of the socialist movement in France. That different understandings of French revolutionary history mediated this antinomy presented the possibility of clarifying Marxism's relationship to the bourgeois revolution and its crisis in the 19th century. Such a clarification, Kautsky believed, would provide the necessary theoretical basis on which the most pressing political problems, those raised by Bernstein and Millerand, could be addressed. Okay. Kautsky accused both Sorel and Jaurès of one-sidedness in their understanding of the bourgeois revolution and the republic, its political offspring. As we have seen, whereas Sorel wholeheartedly rejected republican democratic institutions, Jaurès considered them the outstanding achievements of the French Revolution that socialists needed to protect and extend. For Kautsky, these two positions express one-sidedly the fundamental contradiction that the democratic republic embodied in capitalism. On the one hand, quote, "only the proletariat becomes republican in principle due to its position among the classes of modern society, and consequently, the proletariat can only come to power in the republic. On the other hand, quote, "the bourgeoisie is most directly able to exercise its rule in a parliamentary republic or a parliamentary monarchy whose head is merely decorative. The parliamentary form of government is the one which responds to its class interests, the bourgeoisie's." Kautsky continues, quote, thus the same republic which forms the basis for the emancipation of the proletariat can at the same time become the basis for the class domination of the proletariat. The proletariat, this is me, the proletariat, the only class that is republican in principle, in demanding and shedding its blood for the republic, effectively created the perfect conditions for its further exploitation. Whereas Jaurès affirmed the republic as a historic achievement, and whereas Sorel emphasized the unfree character of the bourgeois republic, Marxists like Kautsky tried to grasp the republic as a contradictory form of both freedom and unfreedom. This contradiction was to be overcome in and through revolutionary proletarian politics. Critically, conducting such a politics required grasping the contradiction as no mere error in reasoning, but instead as an expression of what Kautsky called the contradictions in real society. Right? It's not just like Jaurès and Sorel are like dumb or something, or like it's bad thinking on their part. It's like they're really expressing something about history, which if we're going to solve this problem, we're going to like need to get to the bottom of. All right, I'm going to skip ahead. Okay. The events of the Dreyfus Affair seemingly repeated those of 1848. Just as the liberals in 1848, upon making the revolution, could only then betray it, throughout the Dreyfus Affair, the Dreyfusard liberals and Republicans had proven themselves incapable of consistently defending the Republic and liberal values. Okay, so this government comes into power, this coalition government, and then like Dreyfus is retried and he's found guilty again, but he's not going to have any punishments. In 1902, there's this big scandal which reveals that this republic defending democracy and liberal values, right, is actually spying on the anti-Dreyfusard camp, right? They're using state spies to like spy on citizens, right? And like this is like betraying, right? They're like, in the name of democracy, I'm gonna like undermine democratic rights.
Are you still voicing Kautsky right now?
No, this is me. Sorry, I'm explaining what happens in 1902. Right. So this is a repetition of 1840. I had to skip the part on 1848 because we're running out of time. But in 1848, a similar thing happens. Right. The liberals come to power, and in the name of democracy, they're going to vote in, or they're going to like send Cavaignac to suppress the workers. Right. And then out of this situation, everyone's going to elect Louis Bonaparte. Right. Okay. As seemingly all parties, I'm now in the end of the 19th century, as seemingly all parties were declaring themselves defenders of the Republic, for the Marxists, the matter boiled down to the following question. How was the Republic to be defended, and by whom? While Marxists like Ged, Kautsky, and Luxemburg agreed with Jaurès that Republican self-government was a desirable and historically necessary political achievement, they recalled the experiences of 1848 and the ongoing 1905 Russian Revolution to emphasize the necessity of proletarian political independence. This latter thing, right, political independence for the proletariat, was the fundamental precondition for realizing, quote, the republic that the fighters of 1793, 1848, and 1871 strove to achieve. That's Kautsky, right? Kautsky's not like fundamentally disagreeing with Jaurès about like, yeah, the bourgeois republic and bourgeois revolution was historically an advance for freedom. He's saying you're falling below the level in terms of like means, right? The entrance of socialist ministers into bourgeois cabinets, the Marxists argued, relinquished the proletariat's political independence, which in practice meant shackling the only social force capable of defending the Republic and advancing the bourgeois democratic revolution in and through its class struggle, right? It's like, how are we going to do this? If like the Third Republic is itself creating its own crises, we need like the bourgeoisie is incapable of defending it, the proletariat is going to have to do it. Right? It's the only class in principle that's Republican. Okay. Speaking of Marx's understanding of 1848, Kautsky wrote that, quote, "But, as Marx noted immediately after the revolution's conclusion, the only thing the men of 1848 had borrowed from the Jacobins of 1793 was their costumes, while the men of the revolution still believed the tasks they had to carry out were the same as those of 1793, while they believed that the same forces were at their command and the same methods were called for, the battlefield, weapons, and even the fighters themselves had thoroughly changed. As encouraging as the revolutionary tradition was, it became an obstacle for the new revolution because it hampered the recognition of the real tasks at hand, as well as the means of solving them. As early as 1848, this is me, okay, the Republican superstition, as Kautsky calls it, was an ideological obstacle that prevented the workers from recognizing their altogether unprecedented world historical task of overcoming capital through a politically independent struggle. Right? Jaurès just can't see this, right? He thinks the Third Republic is the same as the First Republic, but in the Marxist theory of history, right, something is fundamentally different between the two. Right? There's a historical transformation that Marx calls capital, right, which throws this revolutionary project of the First Republic into crisis. Now it's no longer self-consistent to just defend the Republic, right? You need to like have a bit more historical specificity now, right? Yet once again, some 50 years later, this Republican superstition was, in Kautsky's words, duping the workers again, right? Jaurès's abstract moral commitment to republicanism, because of its historical underspecificity, fell below the level of Marx and Engels' insights in 1848. Hadn't the proletariat already learned via the bloodletting of the June days what an indiscriminate, class-neutral republicanism meant? And hadn't it had to relearn this lesson again in 1871? Okay, that's how he deals with Jaurès. Kautsky understood the turn to general strikism and the anti-political syndicalism as a predictable reaction to the ministerialist's betrayal, right, to the betrayal of Millerand. Looking back at the history of the French workers' movement, Kautsky recognized a pattern of oscillation between varieties of state socialism and anarchism. History revealed that the two opposites, in fact, conditioned one another. The inevitable failure of the one was the precondition for the ascendancy of the other. Informed by the historical inadequacy of anti-political anarchism, Kautsky could confidently state, quote, "Even if the anti-parliamentarism of the general strikists is understandable, it is nonetheless completely wrong." Right? So he's like getting what they're saying, right? Just like he's like with Jaurès, he's like, I know, I'm with you, right? But you're actually wrong. Okay. Sorel's wholehearted rejection of politics meant abandoning the sphere that schooled the workers.
One moment. Okay, I found this on the web for History Revealed that the two officers...
Right, so Sorel's whole-scale rejection of politics meant abandoning the sphere, politics, that schooled the workers about the shortcomings of bourgeois parliamentarism and republicanism. It was only through painstaking, everyday party propaganda work, through the election of party socialists to parliament, where the workers could keep an eye on the workings of the bourgeoisie, even through the opportunist symptoms that these tactics would necessarily produce, that the workers could be won to revolutionary socialism, right? He's fully acknowledging Sorel, right? Sorel's misgivings, but he's like, that's the only way in and through, right? Sorel's anarchism, like Jaurès's republicanism, was self-defeating, right? It didn't allow the workers to have this experience. Although Marxism shared Sorel's liberal sensibility regarding the regressive character of politics and capitalism, the School of History, Lukács, right, that's his phrase, had taught the proletariat that the Socialist Party and the dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e. the use of state power, were nonetheless necessary. The syndicalist rejection of this insight was itself a regression below 1848 levels of consciousness. The reemergence of Republican socialism and its opposite, syndicalist anarchism, was understood by Kautsky to be the repetition of 1848, where Republicans like Louis Blanc and anarchists like Proudhon had given insufficient leadership to the nascent Parisian proletariat. This repetition, if it remained unconscious, threatened to liquidate the progress in consciousness that the workers' movement had achieved since 1848. Effectively, this meant repeating the bourgeois revolution in its crisis endlessly, right? They're both upholding like sides that are just like going to like repeat the bourgeois revolution, not transcend it. But if the Marxists in the party could objectify the repetition and raise it to consciousness, the proletariat might come out the other side with a greater clarity of its task, namely to get beyond the repetition and thereby get beyond capital. All right, I'm almost done. I know this has been going on forever. Little over 3 pages. Okay, I'll read quick. At the 1900 and 1904 Congresses of the International, the questions raised by the Millerand Affair were debated intensely. Right? So the Second International every 4 years has its International Congress. The Millerand Affair is debated at 1900 and 1904. Right? Both the Jaurèsists and the Gueddists had agreed to allow the International to arbitrate the issue. The seemingly national dispute within French socialism was thus made a matter of great interest to the entire international proletariat. This corresponded to Lenin's observation that opportunism and revolutionary social democracy were both becoming internationalized, and therefore demanded an international response. Right? Literally, the question is becoming an international question. At those congresses, the so-called Kautsky Resolution of 1900 and the Dresden-Amsterdam Resolution of 1904 condemned Millerand's actions and affirmed the necessity of proletarian political independence and a revolutionary transformation of bourgeois society, not its reform. Both were passed with narrow majorities. The socialist proletariat was to have no interest in administering capitalism. It was an important victory for the Gueddists, one which followed the victory of the orthodox faction within the SPD at its party congress in Dresden in 1903. Right? So the Marxists, they seemingly win. Jaurès, at first reluctant to yield authority to the International over apparent questions of national tactics, eventually accepted the International's decision, and this actually sets the groundwork for the unification in 1905. But this is not to say that the crisis of Marxism was ever resolved in France. It wasn't. Just as it wasn't in Germany. Ben, I think this gets to your point. The victory of the orthodoxy in party resolutions was certainly not borne out in subsequent party practice, and even less so in the events of 1914 to 19. In France, the divisions created by the Millerand Affair between the Socialist Party and the trade union movement were never fully resolved. This was itself a subject of great controversy within the United SFIO, with the reformists upholding the political independence of the union, right? So in this weird way, right, you have like the reformists and the anarchists like both agreeing that the syndicalist movement should remain independent, right? But the Marxists and the SFIO are like, no, they ought to become subordinated to the party, right? Okay, so what the defeat of revisionism would have actually meant or looked like is a question I'd like to raise for further discussion. I think it's a great one, right? Because clearly this issue is never resolved, right? On two fronts, right? One, because the revolution never happened, and two, because the parties still remain independent of the trade union movement, and that actually becomes a conflict within the party, right? A new controversy. All right, finally, the conclusion. Okay, returning to the present day, it is obvious that the present crises in capitalist politics don't present a possibility for the left like the crisis in socialist politics during the revisionist dispute did for Marxism. In the absence of a class-conscious international labor movement, the left is resigned to being a mere spectator, perhaps not a content or entertained one, to capitalist politics' paroxysms. However, the left remains insistent on digging up the history of Marxism to justify its spectacular non-participation in capitalist politics. It is instructive that throughout the crisis of neoliberalism, the millennial left oscillated between the 1930s and 1960s as historical landmarks. The Popular Front and the New Left have both had their moment in the sun with the millennials. In 2024, these two referential poles reappeared in the form of the New Popular Front and the student occupations for Palestine. In his 2018 article for the Platypus Review, Mitchell Abador, reflecting on the experience of 1968 in France, asked if the intergenerational conflict that arose in the 60s between the old left, representing traditional labor politics and trade unionism, and the new left, representing radical student activism, could ever be overcome. Whether future iterations of the left were resigned to repeating these two moments, never being able to bridge the gulf that separated them. It seems that the millennials have answered his question in the negative, that no, this intergenerational division would not be overcome. Thus, we cannot say that the question, who is the revolutionary subject of history, has been answered any more convincingly by the millennials than by the new left. With Bernie, for example, the millennials could all find something they liked or disliked, right? You either like Bernie, the New Deal Union man, or Bernie, right, from his student days, the street fighting student activist, right? Everyone can love something in Bernie. Okay. It is noteworthy that reflecting on how the history of the French left tasks the present, Mitchell Abador is driven back to the two familiar historical touchstones, the 30s and the 60s. Abador represses the memory of Second International Marxism, thus mirroring the repression latent in the present leftist discourse around the New Popular Front. Despite the obvious echoes of the Millerand Affair in the era of the Popular Front, the former largely remains taboo, right? So you could just as easily recall the Millerand Affair, but instead you choose to recall the Popular Front, right? There's similar questions at play, but there's something there that blocks us from going back to the Second International. I'd like to conclude by raising the meaning of this amnesia regarding the Second International and what it says about today's left. I'd like to propose that in effect, the left's repression of this period conceals a profound pessimism in its ability to transform present reality. By organizing a disciplined and confident international socialist workers' movement, the left of the Second International transformed social and political reality. Moreover, it sought to critically confront the meaning of its efforts to transform society, how the moment of Marxism's potential regression pointed beyond itself to new possibilities for revolutionary politics. However, the degraded objective and subjective historical conditions of the 30s provided little opportunity for such a politics. Unlike the Revisionist Dispute, which was the product of the success of Marxism, the debates over the Popular Front strategy in the 30s came off the back of Marxism's degeneration after the defeat of the revolutionary wave of 1917 to 19. Concomitantly, the deceptively similar questions raised in the 30s were bound to be addressed in degraded ways. In fact, perhaps their addressal in the form of the Popular Front really served to sacrifice the possibility of a socialist revolution. Right? That's the meaning of the Popular Front for the French Spartacist League. Right? That's coming from their article. They're like, actually, it wasn't just that like the Popular Front was this like strategy dealing with present realities. It was actually a way of like willfully sacrificing socialist revolution. Yet the left remains intent on inheriting that legacy, even if that takes the form of counter-identifying with it, thus betraying an unforced and conservative resignation to its irrelevance in the present. Questions, comments?
Sorry, it's the last one.
No.
So what did you mean when you said that I think you said something to the effect that like parliamentary politics was a kind of like school of leadership for the proletariat? Like, what were you getting at there?
Well, I actually meant to say politics, right?
Okay.
It was in the context of Kautsky's critique of syndicalism,
Okay.
right? Where he's like, I get it, right? No one wants to have to do this thing. It's like an affront to like our liberal sensibilities. But 1848 has taught the proletariat the necessity of, I mean, even before 1848, Marx in the Communist Manifesto says as such, right? Of acquiring political power. And, you know, he's like, actually, Sorel, what you're doing when you're only one-sidedly upholding this liberal sensibility against politics is you're effectively regressing below 1848 levels of consciousness, right? And that's important because, you know, now we have like these mass international socialist parties, right? We're changing reality, right? All these workers are in the unions and they're reading our literature, and you know, this is supposed to be our growth, but in fact, there's actually this specter that we're just going to like repeat the tragedy of the farce of 1848 over and over again, right? And he thinks Sorel and Jaurès are both doing that.
Is Sorel like totally rejecting politics though? It seems like he's rejecting parliamentarism though. I don't see how that translates to a rejection of politics in general. Like, it just seems like he's doing a different kind of politics.
So, you know, it's not just parliamentarism, but it's also the party form, right? And, you know, I'd say similarly, like, the Marxists are like half in, half out the party, right? I remember Chris Catron said something on a panel once that, like, wasn't it true that Lenin was going to, like, abandon the Bolsheviks in April 1917, right? And was going to, like, vie for the leadership of the proletariat outside of the party, right? So there is this critique of the party form as potentially, right, becoming an obstacle to socialism, even within the orthodoxy, right? They're grasping that, right? Marx writes a critique of the Gotha program. Engels critiques the Erfurt program, right? but nonetheless, they do see the necessity and the value of it, right? Did that answer? Sorry, but Sorrell.
It does illuminate what, I guess, where Kautsky was coming from. Whether I agree with it, I really don't, but
Right.
that's definitely something we argue right now.
We said political independence of the proletariat is the precondition for the preservation of the republic, because the proletariat is the only group in society who's republican in principle. Right, that's the Marxist perspective at the time, and yet the Marxists are all interested in abolishing the republican character of the proletariat by through their tutelage, proving to them that the only means of political independence for the proletariat is the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is not a republic, right? So how isn't that self-contradictory that the proletariat is the only group which is republican in principle, and yet the Marxist Party uses that to try and force them to go against their own nature, make them anti-republican in some sort?
Yeah, it recalls the Arendt from this summer's reading group. In a certain sense, the dictatorship of the proletariat would be Republican. If we're thinking about res public, right? But right, like Jerez is like, right? It's a question of what he means by his republicanism, right? He's like thinking that the Third Republic is somehow equivalent to the First Republic, or at least he's talking like that, right? And for Kautsky, right, like I suggest everyone reads these articles. They're great. In these articles, he's like pointing out like all the differences with the Third Republic, how the Third Republic differs from the First Republic, namely that it's now a capitalist republic, right? It's become merely the organ of class rule for the bourgeoisie, and to just inhabit this republicanism would be to dupe the workers, right? That's his phrase. And yet he's like, but there's clearly a hint of remorse and regret that Kautsky has to denigrate the French Republican tradition, right? It's clear in his articles that like he doesn't want to have to do this, but if the workers are going to clarify to themselves their novel task of overcoming capital, they can't just reproduce this republicanism.
Sorry, I have a question.
Just one question, really. Speaking about the phase of the revisionism, do you think that was the only time that in order to really save, really to like raise consciousness, that there was necessarily going to be a suffice answer solution, and that opportunity was, it says that it's been downhill.
Yeah, I mean, one of the kind of things that I leave unanswered in the teaching is the relation of 1914 to 1900, or 1899. And, Lenin kind of thinks of himself as pushing the contradiction to a higher level, right? And it's kind of repeating all these arguments that are happening like 20 years prior. But yeah, and Blaine, you remarked to me one time that like it's bizarre that only Lenin seems to push the contradiction in 1917, and that's a spooky reality. At Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, but really Lenin, in an exemplary way, is trying to do this, dialectical critique of Marxism to Marxism. But after that, it all falls apart, right? And that's what I was trying to get at. In the 30s, there isn't this possibility to do a dialectical critique of Marxism, or if it is, it wasn't, taken advantage of, maybe.
Because
Maybe that's a clumsy way of putting it, but yeah.
the initial situation, the conditions were almost set up perfect for the debate around the first time around. But since then, since it was not sufficing, scarce, suffice solutions, since then, it's not like the conditions changed, it's just that it won't be different. It's not like the conditions were changed. What was different right after this opportunity that we couldn't get in the 30s?
Well, I think that the political conditions do change, right? That's like one half of the problem. That, like, the overwhelming majority of the Comintern goes with popular frontism, and that this bespeaks of a great degeneration of Marxism, right? Merely 13 years after 20 years after 1917, and there is this great confusion that happens within Marxism, and thus, like, all these problems that were once raised in the revisionist dispute, they seemingly reappear, but they're answered in forms that are quite openly counter-revolutionary, right? Like the point of the Popular Front was kind of to liquidate the prospect of socialism in the interests of preserving the democracy against fascism.
And this is where you see like the master colonization of the delusional and the socialist parties just completely just getting involved.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I get a few questions online if you want me to read them.
Sure.
So, first one comes from Christian. I think this question is really referring to section 2 of your teaching. So Christian asks, reformism was a symptom of the success/growth of Marxism. Why was it always there in France, even when Marxism? Why was it always there in France, even when Marxism was marginal? You were emphasizing Marxism as really just one thing.
Right.
E.g., what's the difference between French possibilism and Christian added trails off right? Re-address this question. So, Christian, if I missed part of your question, repost it, please.
Yeah, I mean, so it's France is not Germany, in the sense that the Marxists are certainly not hegemonic in the socialist movement, but nonetheless, the two interlocutors that Kautsky is dealing with, right, or that I make Kautsky kind of deal with, Jaurès and Sorel, like, it's right there in the introduction of Jaurès's history, right? Thanks for coming. He is recalling Marx, and he does think of himself in the tradition of Marx. And Sorel, right? Sorel, his piece that we read this summer in Platypus reading group, The Decomposition of Marxism, is his own Marxist critique of Marxism in his eyes, I think. Right? He's not abandoning Marxism. So there is a what I'm trying to get at is that regardless of the fact that they're not like leading the socialist movement, no one can ignore Marxism by the end of the 19th century, right? And any flare-ups in the socialist movement are regarded, right, by the orthodoxy as being crises of Marxism.
Two questions from a Monsieur Rambos. First question, Marxists tend to talk about Bonapartism as a more general political category. In France and the Third Republic, there was a specific Bonapartist party. Are we understand that here?
Yeah, that's beyond my pay grade, I think.
Second question is, what about French socialism makes syndicalism particularly strong or effective in France? It certainly existed in other countries, but has a certain character in France.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would just, I can't answer that question, I don't think, but there is this significant loss of leadership that happens in the commune, or after the commune in France. And I think this kind of plays a role in the lack of political unity and political prowess of the socialists for a while. And thus the syndicalist movement takes over whatever revolutionary aspirations there are. There are important syndicalist movements at the time of the Second International in all the capitalist countries. Especially the Latin countries. Marxists tried to regard it as partially a symptom of political immaturity in the working class. That the unions weren't subordinated to the party, or that the unions weren't outwardly political.